Beyond Return is a collective of people who've been gathering for about a year. Our goal is to shift society's common sense and to strive for more just and diverse futurisms. We have about 10 different aspirations, and we have a bunch of different research groups that are working towards exploring ways to get towards those aspirations. So one of the things we're interested in is a world beyond ownership, or different ideas of how we can care for and steward resources that is maybe more nuanced, or maybe we haven't even thought of, that is beyond sort of private ownership. And so Anouk is going to talk to us about data trusts. Trusts are obviously a way that one can take care of and steward resources. And I think, people have heard of trusts in terms of financial trusts and land trusts. But for the last few years, Anouk's really had their nose in the ground working on data trusts, which are really exciting. And they have a project called the Digital Commoners, which I hope they're going to talk to us about. Just to say that we are going to stream and record the talk bit of this conversation, and then we're going to switch off the stream for the conversation so that people who are in the Zoom can have a frank chat about who they trust, why they trust, what would shift their trust, and so on and so forth. If anyone who's watching on the live stream has questions or input that they want to put into the discussion, you can put it in the comments, or you can DM me and I'll make sure to add it to the conversation. Or you can ask for the Zoom link and join for the discussion and not the talk. Okay, I will hand over to you, Anouk.
Yay! Thank you. Yeah, I'm gonna talk a bit about data trust. Basically gonna explain a little bit about the journey that got me from where I started, which was as a journalist looking into kind of all the ways in which mass data collection and use goes wrong, all the way to like how I got kind of to data trust, because I think that journey explains also why I think these things are needed and why they're important. And I'll give a bit of an overview of what the main characteristics are. But I'm super excited to hear from all of you as well. So throughout the talk, if you have questions, if anything is unclear, I think we have a pretty diverse audience in terms of backgrounds. So for some, this may all be very obvious, whereas for others, it's maybe the first time you've encountered these topics. So basically, don't hesitate to ask and just interrupt me. It's totally fine. And then afterwards, I really hope to have a discussion about what kind of communal forms of data governance we want to set up, and also around the really basic question of who would you trust with your data. But yes, so to get us started, why data trusts? Before I'm even going to explain to you what I think they are, what got me here, why do I think we need them? So basically, there's a lot of problems with the way we are currently massively at a great scale collecting data, using data. And I'm not going to go into all the problems with that because they're well documented. But some of the problems I see is that right now it's, for instance, mostly the companies that have the resources to collect this data, that have the platforms that we're all kind of addicted to, that allow them to collect data about us. It's those companies that decide what is collected kind of within the bounds of the law, and for what purpose and for what use. So it's not us figuring that out. Another one is, for instance, that the harms of that are often quite collective. Like if you look at things like Cambridge Analytica, like the way we are all receiving information and the way advertising and targeted advertising determines what we see, the way we are targeted also outside of online platforms like Facebook. But for instance, like the harms from people being able to automatically, based on really weird data, decide whether you should get a loan or not. Those harms are not just individual, they're often collective. They have an impact on our election outcomes. They have an impact on how entire groups of people can access resources. And at the same time, the benefits of this data collection and use are often quite private, in the sense that they benefit companies and they stay within those companies. And so that's an interesting mismatch that I started focusing on. And then it's also really hard to understand the consequences, right? Like we develop all these fun new technologies, sensors are increasingly cheaper, so it's easier to collect data on all sorts of things that previously we didn't even imagine that we could just easily collect and cheaply collect. And every time that happens, it's really hard for us to understand how that data, when that data is collected, like how it can be used, not right now, but in the future, and what it can be used for, and how it can be tied to other data sets, and what that allows companies and governments to see about us. So I feel like these are some of the problems that I try to tackle, or at least try to understand more deeply. At the same time, oh, I'm gonna go back again. Well, these are, yeah. Well, these are the problems. At the same time, if we look at what governments are currently doing when it comes to our privacy, when it comes to keeping us safe, it's often really focused on the individual. And we see this in lots of different areas, but definitely when it comes to data, while the impact of mass scale data collection is often collective, is often like it impacts the individual, but often through like the collective impacts that it has on our democracies and on the way that we communicate, et cetera, et cetera. The focus is often on the individual. For instance, in Europe, I'm in Europe right now, I'm in Berlin. We have the GDPR. If you're in California, you have the CCPA. Both are data protection laws that determine what companies can collect and cannot collect about us. But a big part of those laws is that they give us individually kind of the power to consent, or the rights to consent to have data about us collected. But that again is very individual. And there's a lot of problems with these approaches. For one, they often lead to, quite frankly, decision fatigue. And this is really, I mean, these are, for anyone in Europe, really common problems of you want to access a website to read the newspaper, and instead you're trying to click through the cookie banners asking you whether or not you want to install a cookie. Like, that's just exhausting. That's not helping anyone. It's just annoying. And even though I spend a lot of my life thinking about these things, I often just click OK just to get rid of them, right? Similar with terms and conditions. You're not going to actually make a like well-weighted decision about whether or not you want to share your data with Facebook or Uber or whoever. You're just going to get through those, because if you actually had to do that every day, you would be exhausted, and also there wouldn't be enough time. So that's a really like basic problem of just putting all these decisions on the individual. There's also some really fundamentally flawed thinking here. A lot of our data is shared data, like data about, like for instance, right now, if you do a COVID test and you say, well, let's have that data be used for research as well. That's not just data about you, that's data about your family members as well. Like your DNA you share with everyone in your family, including family members who aren't yet born. And it also tells a lot about people who, for instance, share your ethnicity. And so while you are able to consent to sharing that kind of data, they may not agree, right? So how do we allow for that? How can an individual be expected to make all those decisions that are not just about them? Then, and this is sort of similar, but a little bit different, the fact that you can decide to share data affects me as well, even if it's not shared data. So even if it's not DNA or like communication data, like when I send you an email, that's shared data ultimately. Even when it's really just about me, the fact that I share it can have repercussions for you as well. My favorite example here is always the insurance example. I lived in London for a while, and in the UK became normal for insurance companies, health insurance companies, to allow you to kind of share additional data with them. For instance, your Fitbit data, like how many steps did you take every day, that kind of data. And they will give you fun perks like free cappuccinos or movie tickets and stuff like that. And you can easily imagine that those perks ultimately become your insurance premium is now reduced because you're taking 10,000 steps every day. You can decide on your own whether you want to make that decision, and it may make perfect sense for you to make that decision. You may be healthy, you're like, yes, I want that free cappuccino, I have nothing to lose here. But if 90% of the population is going to share that data, or any percentage is going to share that data, suddenly you're going to make you can start making some assumptions about the remaining 10%, right? So you have all the healthy people like, yes, sign me up, right? We'll do 10,000 steps a day and get some discounts. But all the people who have reason not to share that data, like if those are the only ones not sharing, you can make all sorts of inferences about that. And so suddenly, even though they never made the decision to share data, the fact that other people did affects them as well. And so again, I don't think these are decisions that should just be taken by individuals. They are decisions we should take as a society. And then there's the kind of the most obvious one in a way is like the power imbalance, right? Like our decisions, is consent really consent if you can't meaningfully opt out? And that's often true. Like, for instance, we're all on a Zoom call together right now. I need Zoom for work. Opting out of Zoom is not really an option that's available to me. That would mean opting out of doing a lot of my paid work. But that means that I opt into having a lot of data about me collected and used. Because as one person, I cannot go up to Zoom and be like, well, your terms and conditions are good, except for that second paragraph, line 3, you say X, Y, Z, and I would like to have a discussion with you about that. It's not, we don't have an equal relationship. I cannot just go do that. Zoom will just ignore me and be like, well, then just don't use our platform. So, and that it's kind of one of the failures of having individuals consent to things, is just basically their inability to actually consent. So yeah, these were some of the problems that I came across back when I was a journalist and I was looking into these things. And then I started wondering, like,
lovely, thanks so much. Yeah, have a good one.
Yep. And yeah, so I was looking into this. I was like, okay, but what if we cannot just leave it to the individuals? Like, what are the other options? Should the government just make all the rules and decide all of these things? And that equally doesn't seem like a great situation. Like, if we take the example of DNA data that is about your family, do you really want the government to decide what your family can do and cannot do that with that data? Or do you want to have that decision be taken on kind of the appropriate level, which in this case would be the sort of the family level? And those, like, how big that group should be that decides on these things, obviously differs greatly from data type and the purpose of the reason why you want to share the data, who it could potentially impact, etc., etc. So yeah, so then the question is kind of like, okay, well, now what? And so the first iteration of this was a data commons, and basically inspired by all the commons work that has been going on within the context of district commons and the embassy and beyond return. It's a similar thing as a commons around, for instance, the use of a river, except here it's data. And so people come together, pool their data, and collectively decide how they want to make that available to third parties. In this little drawing I made, there's also a little, I really need to change this drawing, but there's a little box with the 3 green humans, which I added to this circle of commons because let's say you do this with 1 million people. It's, again, very hard to believe that all those 1 million people will be actively involved with every decision. So it seems likely that they will elect or in some way appoint a group of people to either help them take some of these decisions and help them steward the data, or execute decisions they make. So it could be that the power flows directly from, kind of in a more direct democracy way, from the entire commons, who then decide which of the black boxes the data is shared with, or it could be that they make use of some sort of stewardship model where there's some other people who like help them steward either the data, help them make the decisions or execute on those decisions. So yeah, that was the kind of the earlier model. There's some advantages of doing things like this. First of all, by grouping a whole bunch of people together, you get collective power. And it's a little bit the same way that trade unions work, especially in countries or in states where there are data protection rights. Like we actually do have quite a bit of power individually, but it's hard for us, like I just explained, it's hard for us to exercise that power individually. However, if we all team up and we're like, hey, like for instance, with the Zoom example, like these terms and conditions make no sense to me. I want to negotiate the second paragraph. Instead of me trying to do that with Zoom, if a million people try to do that with Zoom, they probably stand a way better chance. If Zoom is also not upholding data protection laws, then that group of people can actually have also some legal tools to fight with. The second one is the collective decision-making one. And so the first I always kind of see the data commons as some sort of trade union, but for data. The second one I see it more as kind of a town hall for data. So for instance, the DNA example, let's say you want to really share your DNA because you have a disease and if you share your DNA with certain researchers, they may help you find a cure. But like your uncle has decided that they absolutely never ever want their DNA to be made available to researchers or anyone else. And so you have a conflict there, and there's like you have very different interest in data that is similar. So how do you negotiate those interests? And I think a data common by at least bundling all those interests in the same group of people and creating, it can then also start to create like spaces and places for those discussions to be held instead of everyone kind of living in their own little bubble. We can start having those conversations, and we may continue to disagree, and we may have to negotiate, and we won't all get our way, but at least we start to see like how one's opinion impacts another's opinion. And then the third one is collective benefits. How I started out was like, currently it's mostly the companies and sometimes governments benefiting from data about us. If we pull it and we put it together, we can also start to decide collectively who we can share it with in a way that would benefit us. And that can take all sorts of shapes and forms. I think one really powerful example is Driver Seat. Driver Seat is a data cooperative in California, I think based in San Francisco. And what they do is they allow drivers to collect data about themselves. And these are specifically Uber and Lyft drivers, so people in the gig economy. And those people have a lot of data collected about them by the companies they work for. But they often don't have access to that data themselves. And so they don't know what their employer knows about them. But they also often have very little insight in how much money are they making, what are the different rates for the different trips that they make, et cetera, et cetera. And so this company or this co-op is basically helping them collect that data about themselves, aggregate that data, but then they also use it. So first of all, every driver has like individual benefit from this because they get to optimize a little bit like what routes they take and what customers they take and which ones they don't take, so as to optimize their earnings. But by bundling this data, they can also use it for advocacy. So they've been basically using the more aggregate analytics to let politicians know what's going on the ground. And so you can have this collective benefit of the data that you would previously not have had. So these are some of the ways, and I think in which data commons can be super useful. I think so. Jesse and Zarina and I have been playing around with these ideas a little bit in the context of Social Observatory, which is another, I think, really good example of kind of collective benefits of data commons. So Social Observatory wants to allow people to basically research themselves in social settings. And then the question that popped up was, okay, where does this data go? Because for one-off experiments, you can kind of figure out, okay, people give kind of consent for having that data collected for the specific purpose of doing this experiment and this piece of research. But once you have that data, you may want to reuse it and use it for other experiments or future research as well. And so how do you allow people to consent to that? What kind of considerations about like the collective impact of that kind of data collection and use should be taken into account? Like all those kind of questions start to pop up. And so we start, and like, so yeah, the beginnings of this is us asking like, oh, where should that data sit? Who should make up those rules? Who should be monitoring? Who should be enforcing the rules, et cetera, et cetera. But for the collective benefit, so you already have people deciding what they want to collect for themselves, but this would be an extra layer of like people deciding for themselves who else they want to give access to that data for their benefits. And so far I've talked a lot about data, I've talked a lot about data commons, but I have yet to mention data trust. That's going to happen right now. There's one, so in the little the picture that I showed a couple of slides, this one, we had the data commons, and then we had the potential for like a data steward underneath the green people to help us decide what the rules should be and help us execute. But the question that then comes up is, well, is going to keep those people from kind of just running off with our data? And just doing whatever the hell they want, right? Like we may trust them today, but maybe we stop trusting them a year from now and they suddenly run off with the data. So what kind of legal mechanisms, what kind of guarantees and safeguards can we implement to ensure that that doesn't happen? And so this is where data trusts become very relevant. A data trust is essentially the same as any other trust. So a trust, I think we generally mostly know trust from two things: either the thing that rich people put their money in to safeguard it, kind of to keep it safe for their children, and then we have community land trust, where a community might put the rights to the land in a trust, so that the trustees can steward it on their behalf, and usually with the purpose of keeping the price of land low, so that you create affordable housing that way. And so a data trust is the kind of based on the same legal framework or legal relationships, except that here the thing in the trust would be either data rights or data itself. Data rights could be intellectual property rights over data. It could be your own data protection rights in some cases. It could be like the encryption keys to a database. We can get creative with this, but that's generally what someone puts into a trust. They then either appoint or elect trustees. These are people that we trust to govern that data, and they appoint a beneficiary of the data trust, which could be the same person who put the data in it. It could be a group of people. For instance, in the case of Social Observatory, we could imagine it to be everyone who participated in the research. And we can make it even a little bit broader and say, well, all the communities that we are a part of should be the beneficiaries of this data and this data trust. And then the data trust has a purpose, which could be, for instance, to better understand how we can better live together for the purpose of making the world a better place. And this is a terrible purpose. We can do better than that. But the idea is that it is bound by a purpose. So and that also means that the actions of the trustees, the things that the stewards of this data, the trustees, can do with the data is bounded to that purpose. That is a lot, so I'm going to just break that down a little bit more. So essentially, why is this different from a data commons, other than that I just threw a whole bunch of words at you? There's two ways in which this is fundamentally different. One is that in a commons, which is not necessarily bound to any kind of legal framework, you now have stewards that we are calling trustees because that's what they're called in the legal terms. But those stewards have fiduciary duties. And those duties are very similar to the duties your doctor has or your lawyer has. They're duties of loyalty and care. Loyalty means that the stewards only act in the interest of the beneficiaries. So in the people whoever created the trust has said, these are the people that should be benefited with the use of this data. So in the social observatory example, again, it could be all the research participants. And so now the data stewards have a duty to only share and use and collect data in a way that benefits those research participants. We could also name different beneficiaries. It doesn't necessarily have to be them, but it could be them. The other one is the duty of care, which is really just don't be negligent. Which in the case of a data trust could, for instance, mean make sure that the data is at least secure and not easily hackable, which seems like a pretty good thing to be doing. It could also mean like it would be super careless to just hand that data over to an actor you don't really know, even if they promise that they're going to be nice and they're going to do the right thing. So it can also be like build in sufficient safeguards to make sure that if you provide access to that data to third parties, that you check that what they say they're going to do, they are actually doing. And these are fiduciary duties are legal duties, and that means that if the trustees go against them, if they suddenly start to use the data, for instance, for their own purposes, you can take them to court. And so these are pretty well protected duties. They're not just, oh, we think people should be nice, and only when they are really behave horribly can we take them to court. You can actually, these are really well protected things, in part because the trusts are used by rich people to move money in to safeguard for their children, and they don't like it when the trustees run off with that money. The other key element is that, as I mentioned before, trusts are bounded by a purpose. And that's important, especially in context of the duties, because now you have created all sorts of duties on the trustees. They have to be loyal. There cannot be a conflict of interest. So if they are stewarding data, they can also not themselves have an interest in that data, for instance. But if you make that just very broad and like trust can be used for anything, it's almost impossible to avoid a conflict of interest. So having a bounded purpose is important. Having that loyalty only be towards the beneficiary in the context of making data available for social research, for instance, limits a little bit of what the trustees are bound to do. And also makes it easier to just say, like, this is clearly outside of the purpose, you shouldn't be doing this. Yeah, so kind of from there, we went from a social observatory data commons to a data trust. We can start to see the outlines of how you might go from like creating what's ultimately a commons and then adding these kind of this special legal sauce to it, to whatever you have created in terms of like who you wanted to put in charge of the data, and the intentions behind that, like, which is usually, well, I really trust Serena with my data. I want her to hold it all. I'm trusting her in perpetuity to make good decisions. And whenever we have some new issues that come up, we'll come together and we'll decide together what the rules are. But we trust Serena to enforce them or something like that. But now with a data trust, we would have that same situation, except Serena would also have a legal duty to be like, to not again go against our interests. So it kind of just solidifies the implicit things we already built. Yeah, this is basically the point where I tell you that there's many things I don't know. So this is the journey that I have taken so far. And these are the questions, and there are many more. These are just some of them that I'm still struggling with. I'm trying to figure out. We're also kind of just experimenting to figure out what works and what doesn't. But there are a whole bunch of things. Like, for instance, who do you trust, right? Like, who do you put in charge of this data trust? What kind of skills do you want them to have? What kind of culture do you want them to come from? This can be very personal answers. Like, what kind of incentives do you want them to be subjected to? But then there's also a question of how are decisions made within the trust? Like, I sort of ignored this part a little bit in the rest of my talk so far. But are we expecting those trustees to just be benevolent dictators and decide for us? Or are we expecting to have votes on things and for them to just execute whatever comes out of those votes? Do we want to elect trustees as in kind of a representative democracy and then have them decide after that? Like, there's 100,000 different models, and it's interesting to find out which ones make sense for which situations. There's also an open question of like, what happens when the trustees still make decisions that are in the best interest of the beneficiaries, but maybe not the best decisions, right? Like, there's a difference between someone who's really on it and is doing a great job versus someone who's kind of asleep at the wheel. And there may not be a point yet where you can challenge them and can be like, well, this trustee should not be in charge of this trust anymore. But like, what are the mechanisms to mediate these types of situations? And similarly, if there is a dispute between different people in the commons or in the trust, how does that get mediated? For instance, let's say you have all the people who participated in social observatory research put their data in a trust together. It's very unlikely that they all agree on what should be done with that data, or that they all have the exact same set of interests, right? They probably are going to disagree in a couple of things. Their interests may be conflicted. So that's interesting to understand a bit more about how those disputes get mediated. And then the other question that I also still have regarding kind of the legalities of this is like, so we have a trustee, they have duties. If they don't do what they say they will do, we can challenge them in court. But all of that assumes that we have access to justice, that we have access to legal resources to be able to do that. It also assumes that that at least some people involved care enough and are kind of alert and aware enough to understand when this is necessary. So it assumes some sort of active civil society, or kind of people who deeply care. And what happens when they're not there? What happens to the how the trust continues to govern the data? So those are some of the many questions I still have. What I would really like to talk with all of you about is kind of the first question is really, who do we trust with our data? Like, what are all the different qualities that those people should have? Are there things that immediately make that you don't trust someone anymore? What is trust based on? This is something that Jessie, Zarina, and I have been brainstorming on a bit, and would love to talk about more. But also, if you have any questions for me, please let me know.